The cameras were never meant to catch a miracle. They were meant to catch a lie. But that night, Luke Quinn stared at his laptop screen and realized the person he trusted least in his own home was the only one who had never lied to him. His maid was on her knees. Not scrubbing floors. Not folding linen. Her arms were open, waiting for a little girl doctors said might never come to her. Then Arya let go of her walker. Luke stopped breathing. Whatever he'd installed those cameras to catch, it had just shown him the one thing his money could never buy. Stay with this one till the end, because what this woman does for his family in the next 9 chapters will wreck you in the best way. Luke Quinn had not wanted the cameras. His lawyer had insisted, and Luke, too tired to argue, had let the technicians into his home the way he let contractors into his server farms. Small black lenses in the hallway. One above the playroom door. One tucked into the bookshelf across from the fireplace. He told himself he would forget they were there. He did not. 42 years old, and Quinn Technologies had made him one of the wealthiest men in the country. He built systems that predicted markets before they moved. He sat across from senators and closed deals worth more than small nations. None of it had taught him how to walk into his own house without feeling like a stranger. His wife had died giving birth to the twins. Almost 3 years now, and the mansion still felt like a museum built around her absence. Marble floors that echoed. A staircase she used to run her hand along. Rooms Luke avoided because grief lived in the corners of them. Ava had come into the world loud and certain, and she had stayed that way. At 2.5, she ran everywhere, narrated everything, and treated every stranger like a future friend. Arya had come into the world 4 minutes later and much quieter. Cerebral palsy had left her right side weak, her balance uncertain, her small hand always searching for something to hold onto. She used a pediatric walker to get from room to room. She flinched at hospitals. She had learned at 2 to associate the word therapy with pain. Luke had hired the best specialists in the country. Neurologists flown in from Boston. A physical therapist who came 3 times a week and left Arya in tears more often than not. Progress came in millimeters if it came at all, and Luke had started to believe that no amount of money could fix what was broken in his daughter's leg, or in his own chest every time he watched her try and fail. Heather Reed arrived on a Monday morning with 1 suitcase and a resume that said childcare experience and nothing else. She was unremarkable in the way people are before you know their story. Warm eyes. A quiet voice. She answered every question in the interview simply, without reaching for more than what was asked. Luke hired her because the household needed help and because something about the way she looked at the twins' photograph on his desk made him trust her without knowing why. Nobody in the house knew that Heather had once spent 4 years as a pediatric occupational therapy assistant, working with children exactly like Arya, before her father's illness emptied her savings and her career along with it. She never mentioned it. Officially she was the maid. Nothing more. For the first 2 weeks the cameras showed Luke nothing but ordinary life. Heather folding laundry. Ava chasing the dog through the hallway. Arya gripping her walker at the edge of the living room rug, watching her sister run. He checked the app out of guilt more than curiosity, the way a man checks a bank balance he already knows is fine. A few seconds each night. Enough to confirm nothing was wrong. Enough to feel like a father without having to be one. His assistant scheduled his days in 15-minute blocks. Board calls before sunrise. Investor dinners that stretched past midnight. He told himself the twins were provided for, protected, safe, and that safety was its own kind of love. It was easier to believe that from behind a desk than it was to sit on the nursery floor and watch Arya struggle. Then came the night that changed everything. Luke had stayed late in his study, a glass of untouched scotch sweating on the desk beside him, when he opened the security app out of habit more than purpose. He expected an empty room. Instead he saw Heather kneeling on the rug, several feet from Arya, her arms open. She was not holding a toy. She was not coaxing with a bribe. She simply waited, patient in a way none of the specialists had ever been, and said something too soft for the microphone to catch clearly. Something that made Arya's face change. Arya's hand tightened on the walker. Then loosened. One trembling step. Luke leaned toward the screen without realizing he'd moved. A second step, slower, her weak leg dragging before catching itself. Ava, sitting nearby, went still for once in her life, watching her sister with an expression too old for a 2-year-old's face. The third step. Arya wobbled, and for a heartbeat Luke was certain she would fall. Instead she caught herself, took one more unsteady step, and dropped forward into Heather's waiting arms. Luke sat alone in his office, 15 floors above a city that had never once made him cry, and felt his eyes burn. He was not looking at his daughter's therapy session anymore. He was looking at his family, quietly, coming back to life in front of a woman he had hired to clean his floors. He rewound the footage. Watched it again. And again. Somewhere between the fourth replay and the fifth, one question settled into him and refused to leave. Who is this woman? The next morning, Luke watched Heather across the breakfast table the way a man studies a stranger who has just done something extraordinary and doesn't know it. She poured juice for Ava. Wiped a smear of oatmeal from Aria's chin. Nothing in her manner suggested she had done anything unusual the night before. She hummed while she worked, a low tune Luke didn't recognize, and never once looked toward the camera mounted discreetly above the door. He almost said something. He didn't. He told himself there would be time later, once he understood what he'd actually seen, and went to work carrying the question with him through 3 meetings he barely remembered by lunch. Over the following days, Luke noticed a pattern in the footage he replayed each night. Heather never called Aria disabled, never treated her leg like a problem to be managed. When Aria hesitated at the edge of the rug, Heather knelt and said, "You're brave, not broken," and something in Aria's shoulders would loosen at the words. It was such a small phrase. Luke found himself repeating it in his head long after the footage ended, wondering how none of the specialists he'd paid a fortune had ever thought to say it. She turned every session into a story instead of a struggle. One evening it was a rescue mission, Aria the brave knight crossing the carpet to save a stuffed dragon from Ava's clutches. Another night it was a treasure hunt, small paper coins hidden just out of reach, close enough to tempt one more step. A butterfly game where Aria had to chase colored ribbons Heather waved just beyond her fingertips, laughing every time one drifted out of reach. Ava, who had spent 2 years watching her sister struggle without understanding why, began joining in without being asked. She cheered louder than anyone in the room. She started saving the best toys for moments when Aria needed a reason to try, offering up her favorite stuffed rabbit as bait without being told to share it. Luke watched all of it from his study night after night, the way other men watched the news. He kept a legal pad beside his keyboard for board notes and found, more than once, that he'd written nothing on it by the time the clip ended. He noticed things the specialists never had. That Aria laughed more on the days Heather let her rest instead of pushing her. That fear left her face the moment a session stopped feeling like medicine and started feeling like play. That Heather never once glanced at a clock, never rushed toward a result, never treated the twins like a job to finish before moving to the next task on a list. He began replaying the same clips more than once, not for information, but because something about watching them settled a restlessness in his chest that 3 years of grief had never touched. He couldn't explain it to himself in words that made sense. It felt less like watching a caregiver and more like watching proof that his house could still hold warmth. One night he watched Aria laugh, a real laugh, wide and unguarded, and realized with a small shock that he could not remember the last time he had heard that sound in person. He had heard it through a screen instead. Through a camera he'd installed to catch trouble. He sat back in his chair, the glow of the monitor the only light in the room, and admitted something to himself he wasn't ready to say out loud. He had missed his daughter's laughter. He had been in the next wing of his own house and he had missed it anyway. It was a strange kind of grief, missing something you technically hadn't lost, and it sat with him long after he closed the laptop that night. The following weekend, Luke found an excuse to walk through the playroom himself, something he hadn't done in longer than he wanted to admit. He told himself he was checking on a loose floorboard near the window. In truth, he wanted to see the room where all of it had been happening, to stand in the same space the cameras had only ever shown him in gray and black footage. Heather was there, sorting through a bin of toys with Ava, and looked up when he entered, surprised but not unwelcoming. "Mr. Quinn. We didn't expect you down here." "I wanted to see the fort you two built," Luke said, nodding toward a blanket structure draped between 2 armchairs, immediately aware of how strange the sentence sounded coming from him. Ava, delighted by the attention, dragged him by the hand to inspect it in full, narrating every design decision with the seriousness of an architect presenting blueprints. Aria watched from her spot on the rug, quieter, studying her father the way she studied everything, cautious until she was certain something was safe to trust. Luke knelt beside her, awkward in a way boardrooms never made him, and asked if he could see how the walker worked. Aria showed him, solemn and careful, guiding his hand to the correct grip the way Heather had shown her. It was such a small exchange. It was also the longest conversation, wordless as most of it was, that Luke had shared with his daughter in months. When he finally stood to leave, Heather caught his eye across the room, and for the first time, her small nod carried something closer to approval than politeness. He carried that nod with him for the rest of the day, turning it over the way he once turned over difficult contract terms, except this one made him feel lighter instead of tired. That evening, alone in his study, he found himself smiling at nothing in particular, replaying the small moment with Arya's hand guiding his to the walker's grip. It struck him that he had spent years measuring his worth in numbers that meant nothing to a 2-year-old, and that the only metric that had ever truly mattered to his daughters was simply whether he showed up. Curiosity turned into something closer to obsession by the second week. Luke asked his head of household staff to pull Heather's employment file. It told him little. A previous address. A short work history in childcare. No mention of any medical training, no explanation for why a woman with her instincts had applied for a maid's position instead of a therapist's. The file read like a life someone had deliberately kept small. The gaps bothered him more than the details did. He was a man who solved problems for a living, who had never once let an unanswered question sit quietly in the back of his mind, and this one refused to move. Late one night, unable to sleep, he checked the hallway camera out of habit and found Heather awake long after the children had gone to bed, sitting at the small desk in her room with a laptop open. He almost closed the app. It felt like a line he shouldn't cross, watching her in a private moment that had nothing to do with the girls. Instead, curiosity won. She was watching a lecture. Pediatric Rehabilitation Techniques, the title read across the top of the screen. She took notes in a spiral notebook, pausing the video every few minutes to write something down, her expression focused in a way Luke recognized from his own late nights closing deals. There was no reason for a maid to be studying anything at midnight, and every reason for a woman rebuilding a career she'd been forced to abandon. He hired a discreet background check the next morning, uncomfortable with himself even as he made the call, telling his assistant it was a standard precaution for household staff and knowing it wasn't the whole truth. What came back stunned him. Heather Reed had spent 4 years as a certified occupational therapy assistant specializing in pediatric mobility, working at a respected clinic in Ohio before her father's cancer diagnosis drained the family's savings and forced her out of the field entirely. She had cared for him until his death, sitting beside a hospital bed instead of a therapy mat, buried under medical debt that followed her for years afterward. She had taken domestic work because it offered a place to live and a stable paycheck, never once advertising the career she'd left behind or asking anyone to feel sorry for her. She had been quietly finishing her degree online for over a year, one exhausted midnight class at a time, telling no one in the house, not even the other staff she saw every day. Luke read the report twice, then closed his laptop and sat in the dark of his study for a long time, the city lights outside doing nothing to soften the weight settling in his chest. A woman capable of what he'd watched on those cameras could have worked anywhere. Prestigious clinics. Private practices with waiting lists years long. Instead she was folding his daughter's laundry and sneaking in lectures after midnight, asking for nothing, telling no one, treating his family's healing like something more important than her own recognition. Meanwhile, on the footage from 2 nights earlier, Arya had taken 6 steps in a single session, more than she had managed with any specialist Luke had ever paid for. Heather had not called him. Had not left a note. Had simply logged it in a small private journal Luke found himself wishing, absurdly, that he had permission to read. He sat with the silence of his study and whispered the question that had been building in him for days. She could have been anywhere, he said to no one. Why is she here? He didn't have an answer yet. But for the first time since his wife's death, he realized he wanted one badly enough to find out. Over the next several days, Luke found himself watching Heather differently, not through the cameras anymore but in person, at breakfast, in passing hallways, during the brief moments their paths crossed over the girls. He noticed how she never corrected household staff harshly, how she carried herself with a kind of steadiness that had nothing to do with the modest uniform she wore. He considered, more than once, simply telling her what he'd learned. Each time something held him back. It felt like trespassing on a story she hadn't chosen to share, even if he'd already read every page of it. Instead, he began making small adjustments no one else would have noticed. He mentioned to his household manager, without explanation, that Heather's schedule should include an uninterrupted hour each evening, framed as standard policy rather than special treatment. He ensured her room had a stronger internet connection installed after claiming the whole floor needed an upgrade, though only her room actually got the work done first. He wasn't ready to say why he was doing it. He only knew that a woman quietly rebuilding her life deserved better conditions to do it in, whether or not she ever knew the reason behind the change. One evening, passing her open door, he saw her fall asleep at her desk, the lecture still playing, her notebook open to a half-finished sentence. He stood there longer than he should have, then reached in and closed the laptop gently before continuing down the hall, careful not to wake her. It was a small thing. It was also, he realized later, the first time he had done something for Heather without expecting a single thing in return. He stood in the hallway a moment longer, listening to the quiet hum of the house settling around him, and thought about how strange it was that the woman who had done the most for his family was the one person inside these walls who had never once asked him for anything at all. It was, he realized, the rarest kind of person to find in his world, one who gave fully and expected nothing back in return. Security footage became Luke's nightly ritual, replacing the financial reports he used to fall asleep to. He noticed the small things first. The way Heather sat beside Ava's bed until her nightmares passed, humming the same low tune from breakfast. The way she mended a tear in one of Ava's dresses without being asked, using a sewing kit that clearly hadn't come with the house. The needle moving with the ease of someone who had done this 100 times before. The way she sang quietly while she worked in the kitchen, unaware or unbothered that a camera above the doorway caught every note. She celebrated victories no one else witnessed. A wobble that didn't turn into a fall. A single unsupported step. Small moments Luke would have called insignificant a month ago now felt, watched through her eyes, like triumphs worth marking. He started keeping a mental list of them, the way he once tracked quarterly numbers, except these numbers made him feel something the quarterly reports never had. He began to understand something uncomfortable about himself. No one in his life asked for recognition the way Heather never did. His executives wanted bonuses. His board wanted results. Investors wanted returns they could put a number to. Heather wanted nothing and gave everything, and Luke found himself thinking about her at odd hours during the day, during meetings, during calls that used to hold his full attention without effort. His business began to show the strain. He left 2 board meetings early that week, citing family matters he didn't fully explain. His chief operating officer asked carefully if everything was all right at home. Luke said yes and meant it for the first time in longer than he could remember, even as he wasn't sure yet what all right was starting to mean, or how much of it had to do with a woman he still barely knew. One evening he left the office early, determined to see something for himself instead of through a screen. Traffic held him captive for 40 extra minutes, and by the time he walked through his own front door, the house had gone quiet. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time and reached the playroom just as Heather was tucking Arya into bed. He had missed it. Whatever it was. He could see it in the way Heather smiled at him, gentle and knowing, the way you smile at someone who arrived a few minutes too late for something wonderful. She didn't say a word about it. She simply finished tucking Arya in and let him have the moment of guessing. He opened the security app once he was alone and found the clip from 20 minutes earlier. Arya, crossing nearly the full length of the playroom on her own, laughing the entire way, while Ava clapped so hard she nearly fell over herself trying to keep up with the celebration. Luke watched it 3 times, the ache in his chest sharper than it had been in years, somewhere between pride and regret and something he didn't have a name for yet. He had built an empire designed to give his daughters everything. He was starting to understand that everything had never been the point. What they had needed all along had never once shown up on a balance sheet. His chief financial officer scheduled a meeting the following week to discuss the dip in his availability, sliding a printed calendar across the table showing exactly how many hours Luke had reclaimed for himself over the past month. Luke looked at it for a long moment, the numbers meaning something entirely different to him now than they would have a year earlier. "Cancel the Tuesday dinner with the Hendricks Group," Luke said. "Move it to a call." His CFO blinked. "That account is worth $40 million, Luke. And my daughter is worth considerably more than that," Luke replied, closing the folder without raising his voice. "Find a way to make it work." Word moved quickly through the executive floor after that. Some read it as distraction. A few, the ones who had known him before his wife died, recognized it for what it actually was, a man finally coming back to himself after 3 years of quietly disappearing into his own company. That night, reviewing the day's footage out of habit more than need, Luke watched Heather help Arya practice climbing a single low step near the kitchen, over and over, patient through every stumble. He realized, watching her steady hands and unhurried voice, that he no longer needed the cameras to know his daughters were safe. He kept watching anyway. Not out of worry now, but because some part of him had grown attached to witnessing it, to feeling, even secondhand through a screen, like a father who was finally present for his children's lives. A few nights later, Luke's older sister called, the only remaining family who still checked in on him with any regularity. She asked, as she always did, how he was holding up. He surprised himself by telling her the truth for once, describing the footage, the twins, the maid who had somehow become the quiet center of gravity in his house. "You sound different," his sister said, careful curiosity in her voice. "I feel different," Luke admitted, and realized as he said it that he meant it completely. She didn't push further, though her silence afterward said she'd heard something he hadn't fully said out loud. Luke hung up the phone and sat for a while in the dark of his study, the glow of the monitor still faintly warm from the last clip he'd watched, and let himself feel, for the first time in years, something that wasn't grief. He didn't have a word for it yet. It sat somewhere between hope and curiosity, quiet and unfamiliar, the kind of feeling a man forgets how to recognize after enough years of only expecting loss. Luke changed his calendar before he changed his heart. He blocked out 5 o'clock every evening, told his assistant it was non-negotiable, and began coming home while the sun was still up for the first time since his wife's funeral. Dinner became a fixed appointment instead of an afterthought. He learned Ava's opinions on vegetables, strong and loudly stated. He learned Arya preferred the stories where the girl saved herself instead of waiting to be rescued, and started choosing books with that in mind without her ever having to ask. Heather noticed the shift immediately and began stepping back without being asked, letting father and daughters find their own rhythm instead of guiding every moment herself. She busied herself in other rooms during the evenings, giving them space, though Luke caught her smiling from doorways more than once, quietly pleased with a change she'd never once tried to take credit for. His executives noticed too, though not in a way that pleased them. Quarterly projections slipped slightly that month, a fact his board mentioned twice in as many meetings. Luke listened, nodded, and left at 5 o'clock anyway. For the first time in his career, a spreadsheet failed to move him the way it once had. One afternoon he came home earlier than expected and heard laughter from the playroom before he reached it. He stopped outside the door instead of walking in, some instinct telling him to watch instead of interrupt, the way Heather always seemed to know when to hold back. Through the gap in the doorway, he saw Arya let go of the door frame she'd been resting against and take one step, then another, toward Ava, who stood waiting with her arms open the way Heather always did. No cameras this time. No footage to replay later. Just his daughter, walking nearly 10 steps on her own, in real time in front of his own eyes, her small face fierce with concentration and pride. Luke pressed a hand against the wall and let himself cry without an audience except Heather, who had come up behind him quietly and saw everything. She said nothing. She simply stood beside him for a moment, giving him the privacy of his own emotion, before returning to the kitchen as though she hadn't witnessed a father falling apart with joy in his own hallway. That evening, after the girls were asleep, Luke found Heather in the kitchen and thanked her properly for the first time, his voice rougher than he intended. "I don't know how to repay what you've done for this family," he said. Heather only smiled, tired and genuine, wiping her hands on a dish towel before answering. "You don't have to repay kindness, Mr. Quinn. That's not how it works." Luke didn't answer right away. He only nodded, and something in him understood that repayment had never really been about balancing a debt. It had been about a father remembering how to show up, and a woman who had never asked him to notice, noticing him instead. Something had shifted between them without either one naming it. Luke found himself lingering in the kitchen longer than necessary in the evenings, asking Heather about her day the way he used to ask about board meetings, and finding her answers far more interesting. She told him, hesitantly at first, about her father, about the years spent choosing hospital bills over her own career, about how she'd nearly given up on the idea of finishing her degree before circumstances brought her to his door. He listened the way he'd once listened to his wife, fully, without checking his phone, without the practiced patience of a man waiting for his turn to speak. "You gave up everything for him," Luke said one evening of her father. "And you never once complained about it." Heather considered that for a moment. "He gave me everything first. It didn't feel like a sacrifice. It felt like paying attention to what mattered. The words stayed with Luke long after she'd gone upstairs. He thought about his own late nights at the office, the meetings that had once felt urgent and now felt small, and wondered how long he had been paying attention to the wrong things. He began joining Heather and the girls for the tail end of their evening routine, first from the doorway, then from the edge of the rug, then eventually sitting cross-legged on the floor beside his daughters as though he had always belonged there. Heather never made a show of welcoming him in. She simply made room the way she made room for everyone who needed it. Ava, ever observant despite her age, began treating the arrangement as entirely normal within days, tugging her father down onto the rug the moment he walked through the door instead of waiting for an invitation. Arya took longer to relax around the change, watching her father with the same careful appraisal she gave everything new, but even she began leaning against his shoulder during story time by the end of the second week, a small trust rebuilding itself one evening at a time. Luke found himself dreading the drive home less and the drive to the office more, a reversal so complete that even his driver commented on it, half joking that Mr. Quinn seemed to be in a hurry to get home lately instead of away from it. Luke laughed because it was true, and because a year earlier he wouldn't have believed anyone who told him it could be. He thought, more than once during those drives, that grief had convinced him for 3 years that his house was the saddest place he could be. It had taken a stranger with one suitcase to prove otherwise, one quiet evening at a time, and Luke no longer felt any need to question why. A week later, Luke asked Heather the question that had been sitting in him since the night he'd discovered her old career. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Any of it. Your training. What you were doing for Arya. Any of it." Heather considered the question longer than he expected, folding a dish towel with unnecessary care while she found her words. "Some moments belong to a father before they belong to anyone else," she finally said. "I didn't want you finding out about Arya's progress from a report. I wanted you to feel it the way parents are supposed to." Luke sat with that answer for a long moment, humbled by a woman who had chosen his daughter's dignity over her own credit, who had let months of quiet triumph go unmentioned simply because she believed a father deserved to discover them himself. He asked about her dreams next, carefully, the way you approach something fragile you're not sure you're allowed to hold. Heather's answer came without hesitation, as though she'd been holding it for years and finally found someone willing to listen all the way through. She wanted a rehabilitation center. Not a luxury clinic for families who could already afford anything. A place built for children like Arya whose parents couldn't pay for specialists flown in from Boston, who had spent nights lying awake doing math they couldn't make work. A place where therapy felt like play instead of punishment, where no child would learn to fear the word the way Arya once had. She spoke about it with a clarity that told Luke this wasn't a passing wish. This was the thing she had sacrificed her career for and never stopped believing in, even while scrubbing floors to survive, even while burying a father and a debt at the same time. Luke said little that night. He listened the way he used to listen to pitch meetings before he'd learned to tune most of them out, except this time every word mattered, and he found himself leaning forward instead of checking his phone. Within days, without telling Heather, he began quietly reaching out to architects. He pulled the deed to an unused commercial property downtown, one of dozens sitting idle in his portfolio, and asked his team to draw up initial concepts for a children's rehabilitation facility. He specified bright rooms, soft flooring, nothing that looked or felt like a hospital. He told no one why. Not his executives, not his assistant, not Heather herself, enjoying for the first time in years, the quiet satisfaction of planning something entirely for someone else. By the end of the week, blueprints were spread across his desk at home, a project taking shape that the rest of the house knew nothing about, waiting for the right moment to become real. He met with 3 architecture firms in a single afternoon, something his assistant had never seen him do for a personal project, and rejected the first 2 proposals outright for feeling too much like hospitals and not enough like the world Heather had described. The third firm understood immediately, sketching rooms with rounded corners and low, welcoming windows, a reception area designed to feel like a living room rather than a waiting room. Luke reviewed every detail himself, late into the night, comparing floor plans against the small phrases Heather had used without realizing how closely he'd been listening. Play instead of punishment. He had the design team build a corner of the main therapy room to resemble exactly that, a soft castle structure children could climb through as part of their exercises, disguising effort as adventure the way Heather always had. He said nothing to her about any of it. Not when she mentioned in passing how tired she was after a full day of lectures and caregiving. Not when she wondered aloud whether her dream would ever be more than something she studied for at midnight, half joking, half testing whether the universe was listening. Luke listened. He always listened now. He simply chose, for the first time in his life, to let the surprise speak louder than any promise he could have made in advance. He kept the blueprints locked in his desk drawer, taking them out only late at night after the house had gone quiet, tracing the outline of the building the way other men might study a map of somewhere they longed to visit. Once Heather nearly caught him at it, knocking softly to ask if he'd seen Ava's missing shoe. Luke slid the papers beneath a folder of unrelated documents with the practiced speed of a man closing a laptop during a video call, and Heather, distracted by the search for a shoe, never noticed. It became, in its own quiet way, the most satisfying secret Luke had ever kept, better than any confidential merger or unreleased product launch. This one wasn't designed to make him richer. It was designed to hand someone else, finally, the life she'd earned and never once demanded. He thought back more than once to the man he'd been before the cameras, the one who measured a good day by closed deals and quiet nights, who believed presence could be outsourced if the people you hired were good enough at their jobs. That man would never have understood why a father might spend his evenings poring over blueprints for someone else's dream instead of his own next acquisition. Luke understood it now completely, and found he no longer missed the man he used to be. He locked the drawer each night with a small, private satisfaction, aware that somewhere upstairs a woman who had given up everything for other people was about to receive, for once, something given freely in return, without condition and without anything expected back. The twins turned 3 on a Saturday in late spring, and Luke insisted on something small. No celebrities, no press, no display of wealth for wealth's sake. Just family, a handful of close friends, and staff who had become something closer to family themselves over the past months. Streamers Ava had helped choose hung across the ballroom in colors she'd argued for with surprising conviction. Handmade cards from the household staff sat stacked on a side table beside a simple cake. No fondant sculptures or hired entertainment, nothing that would have made the morning papers. It was, by Quinn family standards, remarkably ordinary, and that was exactly the point. Heather moved quietly through the party, greeting guests, refilling drinks, doing the small invisible work that made a gathering feel effortless. At one point, without drawing attention to it, she guided Aria's walker several feet away and left it there, out of easy reach, near the wall where no one would think twice about it. She said nothing to Luke. She didn't need to. He caught her eye across the room and understood exactly what she'd just done. When Luke walked into the ballroom to join the celebration, Aria looked up and saw him across the room. The chatter around her seemed to fade from her attention entirely, her focus narrowing to her father the way a compass finds north. She let go. The room, sensing something without being told, quieted on its own, conversations trailing off mid-sentence as guests turned to watch. Heather stayed several feet behind Aria, close enough to catch her if needed, far enough to let this moment belong fully to father and daughter, exactly as she'd promised herself it would. Luke lowered himself to one knee on the far side of the ballroom, his throat tight, his hands trembling in a way 3 years of boardroom pressure had never managed to produce. Aria took 1 step. Then another. 5 steps. Then 8. Her balance wavered once, and she caught herself the way Heather had taught her, without panic, without stopping, her small chin set with a determination that made grown adults in the room press hands to their mouths. 10 steps across the full length of the ballroom, straight into her father's open arms. Luke broke down completely, holding his daughter against his chest while the room erupted into applause loud enough to rattle the chandeliers above them. Ava ran forward and wrapped her arms around both of them, laughing and crying at once, refusing to be left out of a single second of it. Somewhere near the back of the room, Heather watched with tears sliding freely down her own face, offering nothing of herself for anyone to notice, content to let this belong entirely to the family she'd helped rebuild. Luke found her eyes over his daughter's shoulder, and in that look, something between them shifted permanently. She was not just his employee. She had never really been just that, and for the first time, he let himself admit it plainly, in front of a room full of people who would later say they'd seen it coming long before he had. Guests lingered long after the cake had been cut, reluctant to leave a room that had just witnessed something none of them would forget. Old business associates Luke hadn't seen in months pulled him aside, not to talk about markets or mergers, but simply to say they were glad to see him again, the version of him that had been missing since his wife's funeral. He accepted the words graciously, surprised by how much they meant to him now compared to how little similar praise had ever moved him before. One of the household's longest-serving staff members, a woman who had worked for the family since before the twins were born, found Luke near the terrace and pressed his hand between both of hers. "Your wife would be so proud of this day," she said quietly. "Of all of it." Luke could only nod, his throat too tight for words, watching Arya across the room as she showed off her walking to anyone who would watch, delighted and fearless in a way that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. Later that evening, after most of the guests had gone and the ballroom had quieted into scattered laughter and the last slices of cake, Luke found Heather stacking chairs near the terrace doors, still in her party dress, her makeup smudged from crying twice in one afternoon. "Let the staff handle that," he said, taking a chair from her hands before she could protest. "Old habits," Heather said, smiling despite herself. "I still feel strange letting other people clean up after me." Luke set the chair down and for a moment, simply looked at her, really looked, in a way he hadn't quite let himself before. "You didn't just teach her to walk," he said. "You taught all of us how to be a family again. I don't think I've said that plainly enough." Heather's eyes filled again, though she laughed through it this time. "I think you just did." They stood there a moment longer than either of them needed to, the last of the party sounds fading around them, something unspoken settling comfortably into the space between two people who had spent months circling closer without either one naming it. Ava's voice carried faintly from the hallway, already recounting the day's miracle to anyone who would listen, and both of them turned toward the sound, smiling at exactly the same time. Later, after Heather had gone upstairs to check on the girls, Luke walked the empty ballroom alone, gathering forgotten napkins and half-deflated balloons out of habit more than necessity. He paused near the spot where Arya had let go of the doorframe, replaying it in his mind without the help of any camera this time, needing no footage to remember every second. He thought of the version of himself from a year earlier, the one who measured love and specialists hired and security systems installed, who had believed protection and presence were the same thing. That man felt distant now, almost a stranger, replaced by someone who understood, finally, that the truest kind of safety a father could offer his children was simply showing up, again and again, until showing up stopped feeling like an effort and started feeling like home. 3 days after the birthday, Luke invited Heather into his study, the same room where he had first watched Arya's earliest steps on a screen instead of in person. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. "If money weren't a factor," he said, "if nothing was standing in your way, what would you do?" Heather answered honestly, the way she always did, describing the rehabilitation center she'd dreamed of since her career had been taken from her. A place built for children whose families couldn't afford the kind of care Luke had purchased without a second thought. A place where therapy meant games and patience instead of fear and clocks, where parents wouldn't have to choose between rent and a specialist's hourly rate. Luke listened until she finished, then turned his laptop toward her without saying a word. On the screen were architectural renderings of a building she had never seen. Bright rooms designed for movement. A garden built for balance exercises disguised as play, with paths that curved like something out of a storybook instead of a clinical hallway. A plaque near the entrance that read, simply, "The Quinn Children's Hope Center." Heather's hand went to her mouth before she'd even finished reading the plaque. "Your tuition is already paid," Luke said quietly. "Your degree will be finished by winter. This building breaks ground next month and it's yours to run if you'll have it." Heather stared at the screen, her hands pressed to her mouth, unable to speak for a long moment. When she finally did, her voice broke halfway through the sentence. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Luke said. "You already did more than enough. This isn't a reward for your job. It's an investment in what you were always meant to do, and what my daughters are lucky enough to have witnessed firsthand." Construction began within weeks. Heather studied harder than ever, driven now by something more than survival, staying up long after the girls were asleep, though this time Luke sometimes sat with her, reviewing floor plans instead of quarterly reports. Every evening she spent with Ava and Arya only deepened her certainty that this was the work she was meant for. The girls became her quiet inspiration, mentioned in nearly every planning meeting, every design choice made with a child exactly like Arya in mind, down to the height of the handrails and the softness of the mats. Months later, an invitation arrived at the mansion, embossed and simple, sitting on the front hall table where Heather would be sure to see it first. Grand opening. The Quinn Children's Hope Center. Heather held the invitation for a long time before setting it carefully on the mantel, as though handling something too fragile to rush. She had walked past that empty commercial lot downtown for years without knowing it, never imagining her name would one day be printed beside its address. In the weeks leading up to the opening, she threw herself into the final details with the same quiet intensity she'd once brought to Aria's therapy sessions. She interviewed prospective staff personally, choosing people who understood patients over credentials alone. She walked the finished rooms late in the evenings, adjusting the placement of a mat here, a mirror there, imagining how a nervous 4-year-old might feel walking through the doors for the first time. Luke found her there one night, long after the construction crews had left, standing alone in the center of the main therapy room with her hand pressed against her chest. "Second thoughts?" he asked gently, stepping in beside her. "The opposite," Heather said, her voice thick. "I keep waiting to wake up from this." Luke looked around the room, at the castle-shaped climbing structure, at the soft light spilling through wide windows, at everything built from a conversation that had started with a single honest question in his study. "You're not dreaming," he said. "You built this. I just signed the checks." Heather shook her head, unwilling to let him minimize it. "You listened? Most people don't." They stood together in the quiet of the unfinished building, two people who had started as employer and employee and become something neither of them had a tidy word for yet, watching the future take shape around them one empty room at a time. On the drive home that night, Heather stared out the window in silence for a long while, watching the city lights blur past. "I used to tell my father, when he was still well enough to listen, that I'd build something like this one day," she said eventually. "I don't think either of us believed it would actually happen." Luke kept his eyes on the road, giving her the privacy to say the rest without an audience watching her face. "He'd be proud of you," he said simply. Heather didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was steadier than he expected. "I think he already was. I just needed someone else to believe it too." The rest of the drive passed in comfortable quiet, the kind that no longer needed filling, two people who had started as near strangers now sharing something neither of them had planned for and neither wanted to question too closely. When they pulled into the mansion's driveway, Heather lingered in the car a moment before stepping out, watching the lit windows above where her daughters, though not by blood, were already asleep. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for seeing something in me before I fully saw it in myself." Luke shook his head. "I only watched. You did the rest." He meant it plainly, without false modesty, believing every word of it completely. The doors opened on a bright morning in early autumn, families arriving from across the state, some having driven hours for a chance at the kind of care they'd never been able to afford. The parking lot filled early. Strollers and pediatric walkers lined the entrance, and nobody looked at any of it as unusual. Heather greeted each child personally, kneeling to their level the way she always had, offering the same patience that had once given Aria her first steps to strangers who needed it just as badly. A little boy with braces on both legs. A girl who wouldn't meet anyone's eyes until Heather crouched low enough to meet hers first. One by one she made each of them feel like the only child in the building. Luke stood at a small podium near the entrance, dressed simply, no note cards in hand, watching her work the crowd the way he used to watch quarterly earnings, except this time every number that mattered was a smile. "I believed I was hiring a maid," he told the crowd, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "What I actually found was someone who reminded my family how to live again." Applause rippled through the courtyard, warm and unhurried, the kind that comes from people who understand exactly what they're witnessing. Then, without warning, Ava and Arya broke away from the staff member holding their hands and ran across the open space toward Heather, who knelt just in time to catch them both, her composure finally giving way. "Mama Heather!" they shouted together, wrapping their arms around her, and the sound carried across the courtyard louder than any applause that had come before it. Heather held them close, laughing through tears, and the crowd around them, strangers only moments ago, wiped their own eyes without embarrassment. Somewhere in the back, a mother holding her own son's hand pressed it a little tighter, as if the moment had reminded her what she'd driven hours to find. Luke watched from the podium, smiling in a way he hadn't smiled in years, the ache in his chest finally something closer to peace than grief. Months later the center thrived. Arya walked beside Ava through its halls, steady now, confident, no longer afraid of the word therapy. Families who once believed hope was reserved for people who could afford it found it waiting for them instead, patient and unhurried, in a building built from one woman's stubborn belief that every child deserved a chance to try. Luke understood now what the cameras had really been for. Not protection from danger. Protection from missing the one miracle that mattered most, a miracle that had been kneeling on his living room floor the entire time, asking for nothing, changing everything. That evening, once the crowds had gone and the courtyard lights dimmed to a soft glow, Luke found Heather sitting alone on the front steps of the center, exhausted in the particular way that only comes from a day spent giving everything you have to people who needed it. He sat down beside her without a word, the two of them watching the last of the staff lock up for the night. "You did this," Luke said finally. "All of it. I just built the walls." Heather leaned her head back against the doorframe, smiling at the darkening sky. "We did it. I don't think I could have gotten here without a father brave enough to keep watching, even when he didn't understand what he was seeing yet." Luke reached over and took her hand, an easy, unhurried gesture that felt less like a beginning and more like something that had been true for a while, only now being said out loud. Inside, on a small plaque near the entrance, alongside the center's name, was a second line the architects had added at Luke's request without telling Heather until the ribbon cutting that morning. It read simply, "Built on the belief that every child deserves someone who never gives up on them." She had cried reading it in front of 200 strangers. She cried again now, quietly, gratefully, with Luke's hand still in hers. Inside the mansion, later that night, Ava and Arya fell asleep still in their party clothes, worn out from a day too big for their small bodies to fully process. Luke carried Arya up the stairs himself, her pediatric walker left folded and unused by the door, a detail that would have seemed impossible to him only a year earlier. He stood in the doorway of the twins' room for a long while after tucking them in, the way he used to watch them sleep through a camera screen, except now there was no distance between him and the moment at all. Heather appeared beside him quietly, the two of them watching the girls breathe evenly in the dark. "We did that," Luke said softly, not entirely sure if he meant the center, the girls, or the family they'd rebuilt one small step at a time. "We did," Heather agreed and left it at that because some things didn't need more words than the ones already spoken. Downstairs, the mansion had never felt less like a museum and more like a home. The marble floors that once echoed with silence now held the faint scuff marks of a pediatric walker no longer needed, left leaning against the wall like a retired soldier. Photographs Luke had avoided for years sat freshly dusted on the mantel, no longer painful reminders but part of a story that had finally continued instead of stopping. Luke thought, before he finally drifted off to sleep that night, of the version of himself who had once believed cameras could substitute for presence, who had measured fatherhood in reports and reviewed footage instead of living the moments themselves. That man felt like someone from another life entirely. The cameras still ran quietly in the background of the house the way they always had. But Luke rarely opened the app anymore. He no longer needed a screen to know what was happening inside his own home. He was finally living inside it. Wealth can build hospitals. It can hire the finest doctors and buy the most advanced equipment money can find. But it cannot manufacture compassion, and it cannot buy patience, and it cannot purchase unconditional love. Those gifts come only from the human heart. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not happen in operating rooms or boardrooms. They happen quietly in living rooms, one small step at a time, carried by ordinary people who choose to love without ever expecting anything back. If this story moved you even a little, imagine what the next one will do. Follow along for more stories exactly like this one, where love finds a way through the people you'd least expect.